Bill Porter sat in the dark solitude of his home and contemplated the heartache that lay ahead. Such a sad and simple story. Two men in love with the same woman, and now you have to make a choice, and for one, it will be a loss. Although perhaps it would be more accurate to say that there will be no winners in this little drama. The early morning shadows illuminated the atmosphere in the house, but not the mood, as Bill continued to run scenarios in his head to get out of the current situation. Despite all the options, the result was the same. He would either have a life with the woman of his dreams or not. As he continued to study the glass of bourbon he had poured earlier but never touched, he accepted that his vote would not be decisive. The decision will be up to Janet. It will always be for Janet. He felt disappointed, realizing that his fate would be in the hands of another. He spun the glass aimlessly, deftly using his right hand. A pointless activity to pass the time. Time passed, and he was vaguely aware that several hours had already passed, and, judging by the sharp, even lighting of the room, it was midday in the quiet den. Will this continue to happen? Suffer while the sword of fate plays out this drama? The final decision was getting closer with every second. A feeling of weariness came over him as he turned his gaze to the backyard. The change of view brought momentary relief when his thoughts were interrupted by the flight of the occasional cardinal or mockingbird, flying into the yard in search of food. Oddly enough, he dozed off only to be awakened by the sound of the key unlocking the front door. Only he and Janet had such a key. Did her appearance mean that she had chosen him? He realized that he could not look her in the eyes. Unable to look at her, he heard the sound of the door closing and footsteps coming to him from the hallway. So he continued to look at the backyard. His thoughts beat wildly along with his pulse. That had to be a good sign, right? She was here, not with him. This should be good news, unless she felt obligated to be the bearer of bad news. There is some moral duty to give him a choice and explain why he lost. Mixed feelings of hope and fear tormented him. He felt someone's presence next to him. Then a white flash of light blinded his vision, accompanied by excruciating pain coursing through his skull. The muscles stopped working, and he went limp in the sun lounger. Then came another blow, causing a similar effect. The glass fell from his hand and hit the floor of the room, spilling the contents of the glass. His head swung from side to side, reacting to every blow. An overwhelming nausea washed over him as he lost consciousness. When he woke up, he felt a terrible dizziness, which gave the impression that the room was spinning. He moved slowly, and every effort caused shooting pain in his body. The acrid iron taste of blood appeared in my mouth. He felt his head swell, even though he couldn't see. His vision was blurry, and he tried to focus on forcing his facial muscles to open his vision to clear it. This was achieved with difficulty. He vaguely heard soft moans, and as he continued to regain consciousness, it became clear that the moans were coming from himself. A sharp pain shot through his side, and he reacted to it by moving to the side. Then he realized that he was on the floor of the den and had somehow landed on the glass that he had previously been holding in his hands. His movement caused the glass to roll across the floor. The relief hardly justified the efforts to reduce the discomfort. He continued to gasp in pain as his thoughts cleared. Why did this happen? How did this happen? What wrong could he have done to Janet for her to react to him with such cruelty? So many questions to understand what happened. As he raised his head with difficulty, answers to some questions appeared by themselves. At first, all he could see were boots. Then, as far as his eyes could see, he saw legs in trousers, a torso, and finally the angry face towering above him, framed by the ceiling of the room. Frank Merriman. Bill Porter slipped back into unconsciousness. When he came to his senses again, he saw that his offender was sitting in the chair in which he had been sitting before. On one hand, he had the exact same glass, filled with the expensive, rare bourbon that Bill Porter was about to drink. In the other, a Colt automatic model 1911 pistol is pointed indifferently in Bill's direction. Frank Merriman, his neighbor of 10 years, his friend, and now his rival for Janet's heart. How did this happen? First instant attraction, then harmless flirting, followed by romance. Then secret lunches, then secret dinners. Each meeting pulled them into an inevitable whirlpool. And then came the successful climax of the romance, which grew into romance, which grew into love. And then came the revelation of the situation. And now Bill Porter realized that Frank Merriman was also weighing what to do in this situation. Unfortunately for Bill, this required a more proactive approach. It's time for you to wake up. As you may have guessed, I borrowed the key to your little love nest from Janet, Frank growled. I hope you don't mind if I drink your precious booze. It's the least you can do for me, since I had to share Janet with you. Frank took a small sip, and it gave him almost as much pleasure as the sight of Bill Porter, beaten, sprawled on the floor. All you had to do was walk away and leave us alone. But no, Bill, you couldn't do this. You kept screwing Janet up and down, filling her head with all sorts of nonsense. Did you really think I'd let you get away with this? Frank asked ominously. 10 years, Bill. For 10 long years you've been coming between me and Janet. And today it ends, Bill, Frank shouted. Bill tried desperately to think of something that could calm Frank down, but nothing came to mind as Frank continued his tirade. Do you have any idea how disgusted I felt knowing that you touched her, held her in your arms, kissed her, had sex with her? The pain in Frank's voice made him choke at the image of Janet's betrayal. Frank took aim at Bill's body, wondering where to shoot first. Where should I shoot first, Bill? The obvious answer is by the balls, but maybe I'll leave that for later. I just haven't decided yet. Bill Porter began to move his lips. The first sound was a croak as he tried to force his vocal cords to work. Frank, he gasped, you don't want to do this. If you kill me, you'll go to jail, Frank. And you don't want that. We can both move on from this now. But if you pull the trigger, there will be consequences. Consequences beyond our control. In some part of Frank's brain, this information was received and digested, and the gun slowly dropped down. Frank took another sip of bourbon, glaring at Bill. You think you're so damn smart, Frank hissed. I'm not afraid of going to jail as long as you're dead and buried. Frank, we lived across the street from each other for 10 years. Are you saying that you hate me so much that you want to spend the rest of your life in prison? Bill protested. Frank replied, for what you did to Janet, for what you did to me, for what you did to my family. Yes, I'll try my luck in court, Bill exclaimed in despair. Listen, Frank, Janet! At the mention of Janet's name, Frank jumped out of his chair and began kicking Bill's defenseless body. Do not dare! Never! Mention! Her! Name! Frank shouted, and every word was accompanied by an angry kick. Each blow caused Bill's body to convulse in pain, and once again he lost consciousness from his injuries. He didn't know how long he had passed out, but eventually he groaned again, which was a signal to Frank that Bill was coming to his senses. Bill cried in pain. His entire body was covered in bruises from the blows. He was sure he had several broken ribs. My hands were sore and numb from the blows. Somehow, during the contraction, he curled into a fetal position, which prevented Frank from reaching his groin area. But Bill could tell that several blows landed on his buttocks, thighs, and pelvis, trying to get to the most vulnerable spot. Frank returned to his chair. In the meantime, he managed to fill his glass. Studying his victim, he said, Like this. Cry like a little one. Oh, Billy, what surprises you have today? Frank muttered mockingly. Not least of all, this concerns Karen and Jimmy. Yes, my children, Karen and Jimmy. Frank sympathized. I know Janet lied to you and told you they were yours. You liked to think that way, didn't you? Frank chuckled. And you know what, Mr. Great and Powerful Bastard? I took paternity tests, and they are both mine. Thank God Janet was honest with me this whole time. The very thought of you having a child with Janet. Bill could see the killing intent appear on Frank's face. Before he could gather his strength, Frank raised the gun again. The barrel, with the hole like a cave, was pointed straight at him, and Frank's face looked like death itself as he pulled the trigger. Bill saw the flames blaze from the shot, and the bullet entered his body. Only later did he realize that he never heard the sound of the shot. Bill was in shock for a moment. Bill realized that today he would die. Frank had crossed the line, and nothing would stop him from killing the man he held responsible for his torment. Oddly enough, another bullet did not follow. "I want you to suffer, you bastard," Frank shouted. "I won't see you burn in hell, so you will live as long as I can hold you." Frank began ranting non-stop about all the wrongdoings he had suffered because of Bill. An infinity passed, and the distant sounds of sirens were heard in the surrounding area. As the sirens approached, the Doppler effect increased, and suddenly, when the cacophony reached its climax, they fell ominously silent. Unfamiliar and muffled voices came from the loudspeakers, insisting on being informed of what was happening. "Do you think they'll save you, Billy? Nothing on God's green earth can do that," Frank said, waving his gun. He continued his tirade. Bill fell back in despair and stared at the backyard, which might be the last thing he ever saw. Then some movement began behind his fence. In bewilderment, he watched as an object was lowered to the ground. Bill attended Chicago Bears football games often enough to recognize the item as a parabolic microphone. Finally, the police will be able to hear, evaluate, and determine further actions. All Bill could do was hold on, and perhaps he would survive. The phone rang, and Bill realized it was a police negotiator trying to make contact to discuss the situation. Bill was weakening from loss of blood and was unsure of the severity of the bullet wound. Perhaps this shot will be fatal. Bill's only chance would be for the police to intervene and save him. Now he noticed several people lying on the roof of a neighboring house. This must be a special forces team awaiting orders. He noticed small red dots playing on the walls of the den, which was now falling into twilight. Some lights began to switch to him, others to Frank. In a fog of scant information, the police did not know who the culprit was. Frank stood up and took the phone off the hook. He was now pacing the room, still ranting, but his behavior was becoming increasingly manic. The red dots were desperately trying to stay on his body. Due to his concentration on the task, Frank did not notice the laser beams that aimed at the sights of the sniper rifles. Then Frank stopped, the decision was made, and Bill again began to watch as the weapon was pointed at him. Frank gritted his teeth and said, "You'll rot in hell, Bill." Then an explosive stream of blood shot up over Frank's head. The gun flew away, and Frank fell to the ground like a tree cut down by a woodcutter. With the echo of the shot, a stream of special forces poured into the house, bursting into every door. The first priority was to clear the scene before providing any assistance. This was quickly done as the police continued to enter the house. Bill noticed that after Frank's gun was taken away, little attention was paid to the body of the murdered man. This let Bill know that Frank had been mortally wounded. Meanwhile, in the noise of conversations, Bill heard an order for emergency doctors to enter the house and treat the wounded. At that moment, amid the noise and chaos, Janet somehow appeared. As she looked around the room, her eyes briefly lingered on Bill, who was awaiting the arrival of paramedics and the gurney that would take him to the emergency room. Then she noticed Frank. "Oh God, no!" she screamed sincerely. "No, Frank, don't leave me!" With these words, she rushed onto the bloody corpse and hugged him to herself. The confused police froze, not knowing what to do. One or two officers tried to pull her away from the body, but Janet held on even tighter. Then the officer, apparently the main one, growled, "Get this man and his wife to the hospital as soon as possible. Do you hear me?" With these words, the medics and gurney that were heading to Bill were transferred to Frank. Then they began to pretend that Frank was alive so that Janet would let him go. As he was being taken out, Janet asked if she could go with him to the hospital. They gently assured her that it was possible. As Bill watched her disappear from his home, he knew that when they got there, Frank's body would arrive at the emergency room, only to be pronounced dead upon arrival. By this time, the hospital will be staffed with psychologists caring for a grieving Janet, and her friends and family will be notified of her loss. Bill felt a subtle change in the room after Janet left. He had to wait for another ambulance to be sent to his house after the first one left with Janet and Frank. He was coldly informed that the estimated time of arrival was 15 minutes. Despite all the injuries, including a gunshot wound, he was not in any danger. At this point, he was given only the minimal assistance necessary due to the entire audience's sympathy for Janet and Frank. He noticed several officers looking at him with disgust or outright contempt, although they maintained a professional approach to their duties at the scene. Bill himself began to doubt. Should he have warned Frank? If he had done this, then perhaps Frank would be alive, and Janet would not be worried about her loss. The shock began to wear off, and Bill was now in excruciating suffering as he continued to wait for an ambulance. No one showed much interest in his fate. Luckily, a second ambulance arrived, and paramedics began preparing him to go. After he was transferred to the gurney, a senior officer finally approached him. "I'm Inspector O'Henry. This is Special Forces Lieutenant Mallory." He pointed to the officer who had been staring at Bill all this time. Inspector O'Henry continued, "I want to introduce you to the officer who had to kill this unfortunate woman's husband today. And all because you decided to seduce his wife. I hope you're happy with how things turned out and can live with the guilt of making this woman a widow." Bill was exhausted and could be seen rapidly losing consciousness as the paramedics put a breathing mask on him. However, he managed to stop them from putting on the mask. He muttered something to the inspector. "What did you say?" Inspector O'Henry demanded with open contempt. With the last of his strength, Bill pointed at the wall and, with all the anguish he could muster, said, "She's not a widow." Bill noticed the surprised look on Inspector O'Henry's face as he stared at the large wedding photograph of Mr. and Mrs. Bill and Janet Porter that hung over the fireplace. Around her hung a typical family photographs of Bill, Janet, and the children, Karen and Jimmy, in various poses. Portraits of a happy family. Bill's last vision before he plunged into the land of Morpheus was the sad, apologetic look of Inspector O'Henry. Subscribe to our channel so that your second shaft doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.